They said working for royalty would be the pinnacle of any career in service. A lifetime of dedication, loyalty, and endless hours spent perfecting the art of etiquette. These were the unspoken prerequisites. Staff would whisper among themselves, trading stories of long days, late nights, and the occasional royal quirk that made life at Balmoral unforgettable. For decades, they had served monarchs with dignity, discretion, and devotion, mastering the delicate balance between obedience and humanity. But nothing, no amount of experience, could have prepared them for the Duchess of Sussex. From the very first day, the atmosphere was electric with tension. Imagine walking into a grand estate, the walls steeped in centuries of history, the corridors echoing with the footsteps of generations who had come before. And then, entering that space, is someone whose presence commands not just attention but fear. Former staff recount the strange, unspoken rules that governed every interaction. The most infamous of them all: do not look her in the eye. Not in passing, not when delivering instructions, not even when acknowledging a simple good morning. Eye contact, they were told, was a bridge they were forbidden to cross. It sounds almost trivial, doesn't it? But try living every moment under that kind of scrutiny, where a single glance can feel like a provocation. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Many of the maids, valets, and housekeepers had never seen anything like it. They were seasoned professionals, trained to anticipate the needs of royalty with a deftness that could only come from decades of service. Yet here, at the sprawling Scottish estate, they found themselves walking on eggshells, their instincts clashing with the ironclad rules laid down by someone who seemed intent on reminding them of their place. "We served royalty for decades," one staffer later confided, voice tinged with disbelief, "but only Meghan treated us like servants." Those words, simple yet loaded, hint at a deeper story, one of tension, fear, and an environment that could only be described as toxic. Imagine for a moment the psychological weight of working under such conditions. Every interaction, every small mistake magnified. A dropped silver tray might result in a sharp rebuke. A question asked without permission could elicit a glare that froze the blood in your veins. And the more you tried to anticipate her whims, the more impossible the task became. Staff were expected to know her preferences, moods, and sudden shifts in temperament without a word of guidance. It was like dancing on a stage where the rules changed every step, yet the audience was unforgiving and the spotlight never left your face. What made it worse, according to multiple testimonies, was the layering of rules that were both arbitrary and punitive. Eye contact was forbidden. Direct conversation was limited to responding when addressed. Tasks were assigned and reassigned, then criticized for being done exactly as instructed. Staff quickly realized that the normal measures of performance, punctuality, discretion, professionalism, were meaningless. The only currency that mattered was avoiding her wrath. And in an environment like Balmoral, where the stakes are already high and privacy is paramount, the pressure was suffocating. The fear wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. Many staff members spoke of sleepless nights, a knot in their stomachs each morning as they prepared for the day ahead. They learned to move with careful precision, to anticipate not only her needs, but the invisible rules that seemed to govern her expectations. The estate, with its historic charm and breathtaking views, became a gilded cage. Every hallway echoed with the silent command to be perfect. Every glance over the shoulder was measured against an unseen standard. And perhaps worst of all, staff began to question their own instincts, doubting whether they were imagining the tension or whether it was, in fact, as oppressive as it felt. Adding to this pressure was the contrast with how previous members of the royal family treated staff. Balmoral had long been a place where staff felt a sense of pride, a connection to history, and even camaraderie with their employers. There were traditions, rituals, and the occasional humorous quirks that made life in service memorable, even enjoyable. Yet under Meghan, according to those who worked there, that culture shifted dramatically. Humor was stifled, initiative punished, and warmth replaced by cold formality. It was not just a professional challenge. It was an emotional assault, subtle yet relentless. And yet, even as staff recount these experiences, there's an underlying complexity. Meghan's public persona, carefully curated and broadcast to millions, paints a different picture. Charitable work, glamorous appearances, and social influence project confidence, grace, and poise. The contrast between the polished image and the private reality reported by staff is jarring. It's this contradiction that creates both fascination and disbelief, compelling those inside and outside the palace walls to ask, what really happens when the cameras aren't rolling? For the maids who left Balmoral, the decision to walk away was not taken lightly. They had built lives around service, pride, and loyalty. Yet when faced with consistent, demeaning treatment, the mental and emotional toll became unbearable. Their stories reveal the cost of maintaining dignity in an environment where it seemed almost systematically denied. It's a story that resonates far beyond the walls of a Scottish estate. It speaks to the human need for respect, fairness, and basic recognition. A need that, when unmet, forces even the most loyal to take decisive action. And this isn't merely about complaints or minor grievances. The accounts paint a picture of a systematic approach to control, subtle intimidation, and psychological strain. From forbidding eye contact to limiting speech to public and private criticism, the environment described by staff is one of constant vigilance, stress, and emotional labor. These are not idle anecdotes. They represent real human experiences with profound impact. Staff recall moments of quiet despair, the whispered conversations that revealed shared anguish, and the eventual, life-altering decision to leave behind what they had served faithfully for years. But what truly shocks, what keeps this story gripping, is that despite all the fear and tension, many staff still describe moments of surreal absurdity. Requests that seemed trivial yet were enforced with absolute authority. Rules that defied logic yet carried serious consequences if broken. A day spent meticulously setting a table, only to be asked to redo it multiple times, not for error but for taste, posture, or perceived intent. These stories, shared in hushed tones and with cautious anonymity, reveal the human cost of life behind the gilded curtains of royalty. And just when you think you've grasped the extent of the pressure, the revelations continue. Some staff described feeling invisible, treated as extensions of the household rather than individuals with skills, knowledge, and humanity. Others recount a strange mixture of admiration and fear, admiration for the Duchess's poise, but fear of her sudden temper or unexpected scrutiny. This tension, this impossible balance between reverence and terror, forms the core of the stories that have finally emerged from Balmoral. What happened inside those walls is not just a tale of etiquette or hierarchy. It's a psychological drama, a high-stakes environment where mistakes are amplified and personal dignity is constantly tested. And while the maids left, their stories remain, compelling, unsettling, and undeniable. They are a reminder that behind every polished public image, there is often a private reality that challenges assumptions, surprises the audience, and leaves a lasting impression. And just as the staff thought they could breathe again after leaving Balmoral, the repercussions of their experiences were far from over. The psychological scars, the lingering disbelief, the conversations with colleagues who had lived through the same fear, all continued to shape their lives. And for those watching, the question remains, if what they describe is true, how will this change the way the world sees not just the Duchess, but the royal household as a whole? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. They say first impressions last forever, but for the staff arriving at Balmoral that day, the first impression was something far darker than awe. Imagine stepping onto the grounds of one of the most storied estates in the world, the castle looming like a monument to centuries of history, the Scottish landscape stretching in perfect, rolling perfection. The air is crisp, the kind that fills your lungs with a sense of possibility. For many who had spent their lives in service, this was the dream. To work at a place where tradition meets grandeur, where every detail matters, and where you are part of history itself. And yet, from the moment they crossed the threshold, something felt off. Not in the way that the castle's walls might feel cold or intimidating, but something in the atmosphere was electric with tension, as if the very air was aware of an unspoken hierarchy far stricter than any they had ever encountered. Staff who had served kings, queens, and generations of royals spoke of a silent rulebook, written in subtle glances, the slightest shifts in posture, the barely audible tone of a voice. And then came her entrance, the Duchess of Sussex. She walked with poise, confidence, and an undeniable aura that commanded attention. But beneath the elegance, the staff later recalled, there was an intensity that made them instinctively shrink back. Eyes darted down, movements became cautious, and suddenly the tasks that had once seemed simple, the arrangement of flowers, the placement of cutlery, the cleaning of a hallway, took on a heightened importance. Every step, every glance, every gesture could be interpreted as either perfectly executed or profoundly insufficient. One maid recounted the first morning vividly. She had arrived early, expecting a routine of familiar tasks, unpacking linens, preparing rooms, adjusting table settings. But when the Duchess appeared, something changed. Instructions were delivered not just with authority, but with a scrutiny that seemed to strip away any sense of professional dignity. A misaligned teacup was not simply corrected. It was a reflection of her presence, a test of obedience, a subtle reminder of the power dynamic. And then came the rule that would haunt them for weeks. Do not make eye contact. It sounds almost trivial, doesn't it? But in practice, it was devastating. Imagine walking into a room, carrying a tray, and being told that your eyes must never meet hers. Not a glance of acknowledgement, not a polite nod, not even a fleeting expression of recognition. Eyes down, always down. Speak only when spoken to. React only when instructed. The staff had never encountered rules like this, and the psychological strain was immediate. But it wasn't just the eye contact. There were other invisible rules that compounded the pressure. Tasks had to be done in a specific order, often with no prior explanation. Instructions could change mid-task, and errors, real or perceived, were met with cold disapproval rather than guidance. The atmosphere was one of constant vigilance. No one knew which moment might trigger a reprimand. One misstep could define an entire day, casting a shadow over everything else. Yet, amidst the tension, staff tried to ground themselves in professionalism. They reminded themselves of their training, the years of experience they had accumulated serving royalty across the globe. They tried to anticipate her needs, to move with a quiet efficiency that had earned them praise in other households. But the Duchess seemed to expect something beyond anticipation, an almost intuitive grasp of her preferences that went unspoken yet demanded perfection. Every gesture was analyzed, every move weighed. Even seasoned staff admitted that this was unlike anything they had encountered. What struck them most was the contrast with what they had known. Balmoral, in previous decades, had been a place of warmth and subtle humor, even for those in service. Jokes were exchanged in whispers, camaraderie built through shared routines and challenges. Now, everything felt tense, formal, and charged with a sense of fear. Staff realized quickly that the old rules of etiquette and protocol did not apply here. This was a new order, one they had to learn through observation, intuition, and, unfortunately, mistakes. The first day also revealed the Duchess's penchant for micromanagement. Tasks that were once straightforward, arranging flowers in a specific vase, preparing a suite for an overnight guest, laying out breakfast, now had layers of expectation that were nearly impossible to discern. One staffer shared a story of arranging a room only to be asked to redo it 3 times, not for any visible mistake, but because the arrangement didn't match a vision no one else could see. The staff were caught in a constant cycle of doing and undoing, never quite certain what would meet approval. And it wasn't just tasks, it was tone, posture, and even demeanor. Staff reported that a single facial expression could be misinterpreted as defiance or disinterest. A simple question, asked with the best intentions, could be seen as insolence. They described a feeling of walking on eggshells, one misstep away from being corrected in front of peers or, worse, in solitude where the psychological weight was even more acute. It was a pressure cooker, and the first day was just the ignition. One of the most telling moments came during a simple tea service. A maid, carefully carrying a tray with delicate china, glanced up momentarily to gauge the Duchess's reaction. A cold, unwavering gaze met hers, and she immediately felt as though she had transgressed some unspoken law. The moment was brief, but the impact lingered all day. Staff later described a pervasive sense of dread that morning, a realization that no level of competence or professionalism could shield them from scrutiny. And yet, they continued to work. drawing on years of resilience and experience. They reminded themselves that this was only the beginning, that patience and endurance were their greatest tools. Still, the intensity of the first day left a mark. It wasn't just fatigue, it was an emotional toll, a quiet erosion of confidence and security. Staff began to understand that the rules of this household were not written in manuals, but in fear, observation, and subtle intimidation. By the end of the first day, a sense of unease had settled over the staff. They whispered among themselves in private moments, sharing observations, confirming experiences, and trying to make sense of the strange and often contradictory demands. There was an unspoken question hanging in the air. How long could they endure this? And as night fell over Balmoral, the estate's historic walls offering no comfort, they understood that this was more than a challenging work environment. It was the start of a psychological test, one that would push their limits in ways they had never imagined. The first day at Balmoral was meant to be an introduction, a welcoming into tradition and history. Instead, it became a lesson in survival, a glimpse into an environment where perfection was demanded, human instincts were suppressed, and the stakes were higher than anyone had expected. Staff realized immediately that the real challenge was not the work itself, but navigating the invisible rules, the silent judgments, and the constant, unrelenting pressure of being in the presence of someone whose expectations seemed limitless. And just when they thought they had adapted to the rhythm of the day, an incident occurred, small in appearance but monumental in consequence. That would set the tone for everything to follow. A misstep, a misunderstanding, a look that lasted too long. That moment, they would later say, revealed the true nature of the environment they were entering, one that would test not just their skills but their endurance, their sanity, and ultimately, their willingness to continue in service. But what came next would make even the most seasoned royal staff question everything they thought they knew, and no one could have predicted how quickly the first day's unease would escalate. Imagine being told that something as simple, as human, as making eye contact could get you in trouble. Sounds absurd, doesn't it? Yet for the staff at Balmoral, this was no joke. From the moment they arrived, they were warned, softly, at first, as if it were a minor guideline. But the rule was absolute. Never meet her gaze. Not in passing, not when handing over a tray, not even when receiving instructions. Eye contact, staff later admitted, became a weapon of its own in the Duchess's arsenal. At first, the staff thought they were overreacting. Maybe it was tradition, a strange quirk of royal etiquette. After all, many had served decades in the presence of kings, queens, and other members of the royal family. Eye contact could convey confidence, attentiveness, even loyalty. But here, every glance carried consequences. Staff quickly realized that looking up at the Duchess could invite a piercing stare, one that froze them mid-motion and made their hands tremble with anxiety. Even a polite nod, a seemingly harmless acknowledgement, risked being interpreted as insolence. One maid recalled the terror of her first morning. Carrying breakfast up the grand staircase, she caught a fleeting glance from the Duchess. Instantly, her stomach knotted. She felt the weight of disapproval press down on her shoulders, though no word was spoken. Later, in whispered conversations with colleagues, she learned that her crime was simply human. She had made eye contact, momentarily acknowledging presence rather than strict silence. That day, the staff realized that survival wasn't about efficiency or skill. It was about invisibility. The eye contact rule wasn't just a matter of decorum, it was a psychological cage. Staff described how even seasoned housekeepers, who had worked in royal households for decades, found themselves second-guessing every glance. They began to lower their eyes preemptively, avoiding the Duchess's line of sight in hallways, dining rooms, and even when she entered a room unexpectedly. The rule infiltrated every aspect of their movement, turning once simple interactions into high-stakes maneuvers. Why was this rule so strictly enforced? Staff couldn't know for certain. Some speculated it was about control, a way to assert dominance, to ensure that subordinates remained deferential and anxious. Others believed it was part of a carefully curated persona, projecting the idea that she was untouchable, impervious, and always in command. Regardless of the reasoning, the impact was clear. Staff felt watched, judged, and, above all, powerless. The psychological toll was immediate. Staff reported sleepless nights, replaying interactions in their minds, imagining moments when a glance might have been too long or a head tilt too bold. Anxiety seeped into every corner of their lives. They were not just performing duties, they were constantly monitoring themselves, a perpetual self-surveillance that drained confidence and fostered fear. The work itself became secondary to the act of survival. Some staff tried strategies to cope. They would consciously focus on the floor or a spot on the wall, anything that would avoid accidental eye contact. Others timed their movements to coincide with the Duchess's attention being elsewhere. Yet, even with extreme caution, the risk was ever present. One maid described an incident where she was handing over a glass of water, briefly glancing up to ensure it was placed correctly. The Duchess's stare was immediate, silent, and freezing. The embarrassment was electric, leaving the maid shaking for hours afterward. The severity of the eye contact rule was compounded by inconsistencies. On some days, minor infractions seemed overlooked, lulling staff into false confidence. On other days, the smallest deviation, a glance too long, a hesitation in movement, was met with a glare that could make grown adults feel like children. This unpredictability added a layer of stress that was nearly impossible to manage. Staff learned that there was no formula for success, no reliable measure to predict what would be tolerated. What made the rule even more insidious was its invisibility. To the outside world, staff interactions appeared ordinary. Guests would see service carried out seamlessly, unaware of the silent fear behind every movement. The eye contact rule created a tension that only those living it could understand. It transformed ordinary corridors and drawing rooms into zones of anxiety, where every step, every glance, every tilt of the head could be measured, evaluated, and potentially punished. The staff weren't alone in feeling the weight of this rule. Even senior housekeepers, who had the authority to guide and mentor, found themselves caught in its grip. They described the paradox of having to maintain control over others while simultaneously avoiding a simple human act that could undermine their own standing. It was a delicate balance, a dance on a razor's edge, where one misstep could ripple across the entire staff hierarchy. Stories abound of moments where the eye contact rule led to extreme tension. One valet's account tells of a minor incident in the hallway. A brief glance toward the Duchess as she passed. Within seconds, a reprimand followed. Not loud, not explosive, but cold, cutting, and deeply shaming. The valet said he felt a surge of fear he hadn't experienced in decades of royal service. And it wasn't just fear for himself. He worried for the colleagues around him, realizing that any transgression could bring collective scrutiny. Over time, the staff internalized the rule, a phenomenon psychologists might call anticipatory compliance. They began modifying every natural interaction, suppressing instinctive behaviors to conform to the invisible expectations. Conversation became stilted. Movement became mechanical. Even laughter was muted, cautious, measured. The human element of service, the relational aspect that had made royal work meaningful, was systematically stripped away, leaving only performance under fear. The irony was not lost on the staff. They had devoted their lives to serving royalty, mastering decorum, discretion, and attentiveness. Yet they were being held to standards that transcended professional expectations, encroaching on the personal, the instinctive, the human. Eye contact, something as natural as breathing, became a transgression. Their expertise, their judgment, their instincts, all subordinated to a rule that made them feel invisible and infantilized. And yet, despite the oppressive nature of this rule, staff continued their duties. They adapted, learned the rhythms, perfected the art of avoidance. But the eye contact rule left its mark, not just in behavior, but in the psyche. It created a pervasive sense of vulnerability, a constant awareness that the slightest mistake could result in emotional reprimand or subtle humiliation. They carried this weight with them, in every hallway, every room, every interaction, knowing that at any moment, it could be tested. By the end of the first week, staff began sharing whispered accounts, realizing that everyone had experienced some form of psychological strain due to this rule. The collective understanding was clear. This wasn't a minor eccentricity. It was a core part of the environment, shaping behavior, instilling fear, and reinforcing the hierarchy. And it was only the beginning. Because what the staff would discover in the following weeks would reveal that eye contact was merely the surface of a far deeper, more pervasive set of rules. Rules designed to control, intimidate, and maintain absolute dominance. And those who dared to question, to falter, or to forget even briefly, would learn just how high the stakes truly were. But the consequences of breaking this rule, or even bending it unknowingly, would escalate in ways that no one expected, setting the stage for a cascade of tension and fear that would ripple through every corner of Balmoral. Silence can be golden, until it becomes a weapon. At Balmoral, staff quickly learned that speaking out of turn was not merely discouraged, it was forbidden. The rule was simple in words, but devastating in practice. You spoke only when spoken to. No questions, no clarifications, no small talk, nothing that suggested initiative or independent thought. And yet, the consequences of violating this invisible law were profound. For seasoned staff, trained to anticipate the needs of royalty and act decisively, the rule was a shock. Imagine a life spent learning to respond, to think 2 steps ahead, to act on subtle cues, and then being told that even the slightest vocalization could result in reprimand. The irony wasn't lost on them. They had mastered discretion and tact, yet here, mastery of protocol could not protect them from fear. Every action had to be calculated, every word weighed, every breath measured. One housekeeper recounted her first morning shift under this rule. Tasked with setting the breakfast table, she hesitated for just a moment, unsure of whether the silverware needed rearranging. She began to ask a question, her voice barely above a whisper, when a sharp look from across the room froze her in place. The lesson was immediate and clear. Even the gentlest inquiry could be interpreted as defiance. That moment, small as it seemed, set the tone for the entire day, and soon, for the entire staff. The silence was not only external, it permeated internal thought. Staff described how they began policing their own minds, calculating each interaction before it occurred. Even casual eye contact or a slight nod became fraught with risk. In effect, silence was no longer just a rule. It was armor, a shield against criticism that required constant vigilance. Their very humanity was suppressed in favor of a mechanical, cautious obedience that drained energy, focus, and morale. The impact extended beyond fear. Staff began to notice how communication among themselves suffered. Whispered exchanges in private corners, meant to clarify duties or share observations, became fraught with tension. "If she hears us talking," one maid said, "even in another room, you feel like punishment is coming." Simple coordination, a shared glance, or a short word to confirm a task, carried the weight of potential disaster. The rule created isolation, even within a team that relied on each other for support. Perhaps the most insidious element of the silence mandate was its unpredictability. On some occasions, a question asked respectfully might be overlooked. On others, it could trigger a rebuke. Staff learned quickly that there were no guarantees, only guidelines written in invisible ink, visible only when crossed. One valet described holding his tongue for hours, carefully monitoring a task, only to be criticized for being too slow. The contradiction was maddening. Speak, and you risk reprimand. Stay silent, and you risk error. Even seemingly innocuous tasks carried enormous pressure. Cleaning a sitting room, preparing tea, arranging flowers. Any small deviation from an invisible standard could become a flashpoint. Staff became hyper-aware of their movements, their postures, their timing. Silence was no longer just a matter of obedience. It was a survival strategy. Every word saved or uttered could mean the difference between acceptance and humiliation. The psychological consequences were profound. Staff reported headaches, anxiety, and sleepless nights. The mental effort required to maintain silence while performing complex, high-stakes tasks was exhausting. They felt constantly monitored, as if a single misstep in conversation could undo all the hours of meticulous labor. Over time, the staff admitted, it began to feel like being trapped in a silent nightmare, where instinct and experience were rendered useless by the weight of arbitrary rules. Yet the Duchess's reasoning, or lack thereof, remained opaque. Some staff speculated it was about control, creating a hierarchy in which she alone held the power to initiate communication, reinforcing her authority by limiting verbal interaction. Others suggested it was about image, projecting composure and omnipotence while keeping staff off balance, dependent, and anxious. Whatever the reasoning, the effect was undeniable. Staff were silenced, vulnerable, and perpetually on edge. Staff stories often highlighted the absurdity of the rule in practice. One housekeeper described a moment when she was unsure how to handle a breakfast service. Should she alert the Duchess to a missing item? Should she wait silently? She chose silence, and was later criticized for failing to act. Another staff member attempted to clarify a simple task in a hushed voice and was met with icy disdain. The message was clear. Even good intentions could backfire, reinforcing the constant fear that defined daily life at Balmoral. Over time, the staff internalized the rule to the point of instinct. Movement became almost robotic, words carefully measured, and thoughts quietly monitored. The training that had once served them so well, anticipating needs, problem-solving, acting independently, was sidelined in favor of caution, compliance, and invisibility. Humor, warmth, and camaraderie, once part of life and service, were suppressed to avoid drawing attention or criticism. The work became a silent performance, each staff member a ghost navigating the palace corridors with trembling precision. The silence rule also exacerbated existing tensions among staff. Normally, teams in royal households function with a delicate balance of trust, communication, and shared responsibility. Here, with speech restricted and observation paramount, the bonds that typically provided support were frayed. Staff described whispered conversations in kitchens or behind closed doors, trying to make sense of what was expected, who could be trusted, and how to survive another day. Even colleagues became part of the surveillance system, each one wary of inadvertently drawing attention to another. What made the experience even more harrowing was the lack of guidance. Traditional royal households had structured protocols, manuals, and hierarchies. Here, the rules were unwritten, shifting, and sometimes contradictory. A task completed perfectly one day could be deemed incorrect the next, and speaking out of turn, even once, could trigger a reprimand. Staff began to understand that silence was both shield and trap, necessary for survival, yet isolating and demoralizing. Yet despite these challenges, staff persevered. They learned to anticipate moods, observe subtle cues, and perform with a quiet efficiency that masked their fear. They mastered the art of moving, cleaning, and arranging without drawing attention. But the mental and emotional cost was steep. Many admitted that by the end of a shift, they felt drained, anxious, and emotionally frayed, their confidence chipped away by the relentless enforcement of silence. And still, the rule was only the beginning. As staff would soon discover, silence intersected with other oppressive expectations, eye contact forbidden, tasks constantly scrutinized, and whims changing without notice. The interplay of these rules created a perfect storm of pressure, fear, and emotional strain, ensuring that even the most seasoned staff struggled to maintain composure. But what they hadn't yet realized was that silence was also a test of endurance, loyalty, and psychological resilience. Those who survived, who adapted, learned lessons about human behavior, power, and control that would stay with them long after leaving Balmoral. Yet for some, the cumulative weight of enforced silence and fear would push them to the breaking point, forcing decisions that would change the course of their careers and lives forever. And what happened when someone finally dared to break the silence, whether intentionally or accidentally, would shock even those who had long served royalty. The repercussions were swift, severe, and unforgettable, setting the stage for an escalation of tension that would define the very essence of life under the Duchess's scrutiny. Imagine working in a palace where luxury isn't just expected, it's weaponized. For the staff at Balmoral, the line between elegance and tyranny blurred almost immediately. Tasks that would normally be routine became tests of patience, precision, and nerves. Every request carried the weight of expectation, every gesture was scrutinized, and nothing was ever enough. Former staff later described these demands as diva-like, though the word barely scratches the surface. These weren't mere preferences. They were rules enforced with an intensity that left employees walking on eggshells, terrified of missteps. The first striking example came during wardrobe preparations. The Duchess of Sussex reportedly expected a level of attention to detail that went beyond ordinary royal standards. Outfits had to be meticulously arranged, shoes aligned, accessories positioned just so, often with no guidance, and under severe time pressure. A misaligned necklace or a slightly crooked shoe could elicit a glare, a sharp word, or a sudden, unspoken coldness that sent shivers down a staffer's spine. One maid recounted spending nearly an hour adjusting the folds of a dress, only to be told, "Not like that," without explanation, and asked to redo it entirely. These demands extended far beyond clothing. Staff described scenarios that seemed absurd but were enforced with absolute authority. Breakfasts had to be prepared at specific temperatures, with the eggs, toast, and beverages aligned according to preferences known only to the Duchess. Flowers were to be arranged to satisfy aesthetic standards so exacting that minor deviations prompted immediate correction. Even the smallest inconsistencies, placement of a fork, angle of a chair, could be perceived as an affront, triggering silent judgment or overt reprimand. Perhaps most disorienting for staff was the unpredictability of the demands. Instructions could change mid-task, sometimes without a word. A tray prepared perfectly moments ago might be returned for adjustment. Beds made flawlessly could be undone for minor perceived faults. Staff described the constant recalibration as exhausting, a mental strain that left them second-guessing every action. And because explanations were rarely given, the staff were left navigating a labyrinth of arbitrary rules, always guessing at expectations that seemed to shift like sand. Some of the demands were highly personal and unusual, even for a royal household. One housekeeper recalled being asked to fetch obscure items on short notice, or to perform tasks unrelated to professional duties, like scouting for specific flowers in the estate gardens or adjusting decorations to match the Duchess's ever-changing aesthetic vision. Another staffer mentioned being asked to reposition furniture repeatedly, only to receive subtle but unmistakable signals of disapproval when the work did not meet an unspoken standard. It was as if every task, regardless of its importance, was a test of obedience and perfection. The psychological impact of these diva-like expectations cannot be overstated. Staff felt under constant surveillance, aware that even a minor misstep could result in embarrassment, criticism, or worse, being labeled incompetent. Their movements, speech, and expressions were all under scrutiny. Even the way they carried themselves in the hallway, whether polite or deferential, was observed and evaluated. The pressure to anticipate every need, to perform flawlessly, and to maintain composure under scrutiny created a tense, oppressive environment. One particularly vivid story involved a last-minute wardrobe change. A staff member recounted being summoned to fetch an entirely different outfit mere minutes before a scheduled appearance. The original attire had been meticulously prepared, but the Duchess's whims had shifted, and the staffer had no time to question or clarify. The frantic adjustments left them physically exhausted and mentally strained. Yet the work had to be completed silently, without complaint, and with the precision expected at all times. The incident left the staffer shaken, realizing that even experience and skill could not shield them from the unpredictability of these demands. Humor, once a coping mechanism, became dangerous. Staff reported suppressing laughter or light-hearted conversation, understanding that any display of levity could be misinterpreted as insolence or lack of seriousness. Even mundane tasks, like arranging a table for tea or setting up a room, became exercises in extreme caution, performed with an almost robotic precision that drained the joy from their work. It was as if every action was weighed, measured, and judged, leaving little room for individuality or human error. The intensity of these demands created a feedback loop of fear and compliance. Staff pushed themselves harder, striving for perfection to avoid criticism. Yet the higher their efforts, the more exacting the expectations became. One valet described it as chasing a moving target. The more you succeeded, the higher the bar was set, leaving little sense of accomplishment or relief. The result was exhaustion, anxiety, and a creeping sense of futility. Adding to the strain was the perception that these diva-like demands were sometimes contradictory. An arrangement of flowers that pleased one minute could be deemed incorrect the next. A perfectly set table might be criticized after being left for only a few moments. Staff had to adapt constantly, read subtle cues, and guess at preferences that were often invisible. The unpredictability magnified stress, creating an environment where confidence eroded and mistakes felt inevitable. Despite the intensity, the staff maintained professionalism. They mastered strategies to anticipate and accommodate demands, learning the rhythms of the Duchess's preferences and moods. But the cost was high: long hours, heightened stress, and emotional depletion. Staff began to understand that survival depended not only on skill but on an acute awareness of the Duchess's state, moods, and preferences, often shifting unpredictably and without warning. There were moments that bordered on absurdity. One maid recalled spending over an hour adjusting flowers for a small gathering, only to be told the centerpiece didn't feel right and must be rearranged. Another described the task of placing a single cushion at a precise angle, a level of precision so extreme that it became both a test and a torment. These stories, shared in hushed tones among staff, revealed the extraordinary lengths they went to meet expectations, even when the logic behind the demands seemed elusive. They say Paris is the city of lights, glamour, style, and for decades, it has been the proving ground for fashion's elite. Designers, models, celebrities, and royalty all walk the cobblestone streets and crimson carpets, hoping to make an impression that will be remembered long after the runway lights dim. But on one fateful spring evening, the eyes of the world weren't on the designers, the models, or even the historic show-stopping gowns. All attention was on one woman, Meghan Markle, and the world would never forget the moment Chris Rock stepped up to the microphone. "You can't fight the monarchy, heal the world, and sell skincare all at once," he said. That single line ricocheted across social media platforms, dominating headlines, trending for hours, and sparking a conversation that no one, not even Meghan herself, could have predicted. But what was it about Meghan Markle's all-white ensemble that turned a celebrated fashion moment into a global punchline? And why did the world react with such an unrelenting frenzy? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The Duchess of Sussex had arrived at the Balenciaga Women's Wear Spring-Summer 2026 show in Paris, a city that has long defined high fashion and sophisticated elegance. But instead of blending into the sea of chic attendees, Meghan's choice to wear a sweeping all-white ensemble, complete with dramatic cape, tailored pants, and satin heels, made a statement that left spectators whispering, cameras flashing, and social media exploding. On paper, it was a breathtaking look. In practice, it became the perfect setup for Chris Rock's biting commentary. Consider the symbolism. White is often associated with purity, peace, and enlightenment. It is an audacious choice that demands attention, even in a room filled with fashion royalty. But Meghan's ensemble didn't just evoke haute couture. It evoked something far more complicated: comparisons to historical icons. Critics and observers alike began drawing connections to Gandhi, the ultimate symbol of pacifism, Princess Diana, the ever-complicated royal icon, and even Oprah Winfrey, the queen of influence and public persuasion. To some, Meghan was channeling these legendary figures all at once. To others, she was stepping into dangerous territory, risking being perceived as tone-deaf and self-serving. Chris Rock didn't hold back. With his trademark blend of humor, precision, and audacity, he delivered a critique that cut through the curated public image Meghan has cultivated. He saw through the layered symbolism and laid bare the contradiction. Meghan's attempt to represent multiple icons simultaneously while selling a personal brand of wellness and activism. "You can't fight the monarchy, heal the world, and sell skincare all at once," he declared, pointing to the tension between public perception and private intention, between aspirational image and harsh reality. But why did this moment land so hard, so fast, and so publicly? Part of it has to do with timing. The royal family is no stranger to public scrutiny, but Meghan Markle represents a new kind of royal, one who straddles the line between celebrity and monarchy, activism and branding. Every move is dissected, every outfit analyzed, and every public appearance carries layers of meaning that few can fully grasp. Chris Rock's joke did more than poke fun. It highlighted the collision of these worlds, exposing the vulnerabilities inherent in Meghan's carefully crafted persona. From the moment she stepped out of the limo onto the Parisian red carpet, Meghan's presence was magnetic. Cameras swiveled, flashes erupted, and the soft murmur of the crowd shifted into a low hum of anticipation. Observers took in the crisp lines of her outfit, the sheen of her satin heels, and the flowing cape that seemed to command the space around her. It was not just an outfit, it was a statement. And in fashion, as in public life, statements can be double-edged swords. For many, Meghan's appearance represented ambition, confidence, and self-expression. But others saw something different, an overreach, an attempt to embody figures who carry legacies far beyond her own, and perhaps a misstep in understanding the nuances of public perception. In that room filled with influencers, journalists, designers, and royalty, every detail mattered. From the way the fabric fell to the tilt of her head to the subtle expressions that flickered across her face. Social media reacted almost instantaneously. Twitter feeds erupted with commentary, memes, and analysis. Instagram stories dissected every angle of the cape, comparing it to historical images of Gandhi's robes, Diana's iconic white dresses, and Oprah's many powerful moments. Within minutes, the narrative was spinning. Meghan was being criticized for being too bold, too performative, or simply out of touch. The internet, as it always does, amplified every opinion, creating a cacophony of voices that left no room for nuance. But what makes this moment so compelling isn't just the fashion or the critique. It's the human element behind it. Meghan Markle is more than a public figure. She is a woman navigating a world that has historically scrutinized her every decision. Every outfit, every word, every appearance is filtered through the lenses of media, monarchy, and global culture. And when Chris Rock delivered that line, it wasn't just a joke. It was a spotlight on the precarious balancing act she performs daily. What many fail to consider is the preparation, strategy, and intent that go into these appearances. Meghan's choice of an all-white ensemble wasn't random. Every element, the tailoring, the cape, the accessories, was likely chosen to convey strength, elegance, and a subtle nod to figures she admires. But in a world obsessed with instant judgment, intention is often overshadowed by perception. Chris Rock, knowingly or not, crystallized that tension in a single moment, one that would be replayed endlessly in news cycles, social media posts, and late-night commentary. At the same time, the reaction to this moment reveals something profound about celebrity culture, monarchy, and media dynamics in 2026. Society loves to deconstruct, analyze, and sometimes vilify public figures, especially those who challenge established norms. Meghan Markle's dual identity as a former royal and a modern influencer makes her particularly susceptible to this scrutiny. In one evening, in one outfit, in one room filled with history and prestige, the collision of these worlds became impossible to ignore. And yet, as the cameras clicked and the crowd murmured, a quiet tension lingered backstage. Whispers suggested that some fashion insiders were concerned about how the ensemble would be received, while others applauded the boldness. The designers, photographers, and influencers all had their interpretations, and Meghan herself was likely aware of the stakes. But none of this could prepare her for the lightning strike delivered in the form of a joke by one of the world's most unflinching comedians. The question lingers, was Chris Rock's comment simply humor, or was it a mirror held up to the contradictions in Meghan's public persona? Could a joke reveal deeper truths about the challenge of being everything to everyone in the most public of arenas? And perhaps most provocatively, what does this moment say about the intersection of celebrity, fashion, and monarchy in a world that increasingly conflates image with influence? As the night unfolded, it became clear that this wasn't just a fashion moment. It was a cultural event. Media outlets dissected every syllable of Chris Rock's quip, fashion critics analyzed every fold of the cape, and social media users debated the appropriateness of Meghan's references. The line between admiration and ridicule blurred, leaving Meghan at the center of a whirlwind that would dominate headlines for weeks. But what comes next is even more compelling. This isn't the end of the story, it's only the beginning. The reactions, the memes, the speculation, the private conversations behind closed doors, all of it feeds into a narrative that continues to evolve. And in true dramatic fashion, Every revelation sets the stage for the next, leaving the world wondering, how will Meghan respond? And what will the next chapter of her Paris Fashion Week saga reveal? One thing is certain, Paris remembers. The city, the audience, the cameras, the flashes, and the iconic line from Chris Rock have cemented this moment in the annals of fashion and celebrity culture. And the reverberations are far from over. Because when you try to be everything to everyone, the world will judge, laugh, critique, and sometimes it will shock you. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Paris Fashion Week, a name that carries weight, prestige, and an almost mythic aura in the world of style. For designers, models, influencers, and celebrities alike, it's not just an event. It's a battlefield where reputations are made, legacies are cemented, and missteps can haunt careers for years. But on this particular evening, all eyes weren't on the designers or the models strutting the runway. They weren't on the flashy lights or the sprawling venue adorned with crystal chandeliers and velvet drapes. No, the gaze of the world converged on one figure, one entrance, and one sweeping white cape that seemed to command attention even before Meghan Markle took her first step onto the Parisian red carpet. From the moment the limousine doors opened, cameras swiveled. Flashbulbs popped relentlessly. The air was thick with anticipation and a quiet tension that seemed to ripple across the crowd of fashion elites, journalists, and influencers. Meghan's choice of an all-white ensemble was striking, almost daring. The tailored pants hugged her silhouette perfectly. The flowing cape cascaded dramatically behind her, and her sleek black satin heels clicked confidently against the polished marble floors. To the untrained eye, it was simply a stunning outfit. But in a room full of cultural critics, fashion aficionados, and royalty watchers, it was a statement. And statements, especially bold ones, come with risks. There's a certain choreography to a red carpet entrance, and Meghan executed it flawlessly, or at least, according to outward appearances. Every step was deliberate, every smile measured, every glance calculated to convey poise and elegance. Yet, as she approached the waiting crowd of photographers, there was a flicker, a subtle tension that suggested awareness of the stakes. She was not merely attending a fashion show. She was stepping into a gauntlet where every movement, every choice, would be scrutinized, dissected, and potentially weaponized in the court of public opinion. Paris, with its reputation as the epicenter of haute couture, can be unforgiving. The city exalts creativity and rewards audacity, but it is equally quick to criticize overreach. Meghan's ensemble, so pure, so commanding, so symbolic, did not blend. It demanded attention. It demanded analysis. And as whispers rippled through the crowd, the moment became electric. Critics began evaluating every detail. The cut of the cape, the fabric's texture, the silhouette's echoes of iconic historical figures. Some admired the boldness, recognizing the power of presence in a room filled with equally powerful personalities. Others bristled, interpreting the ensemble as overly ambitious, or worse, presumptuous. To understand the gravity of this moment, it's necessary to explore the layers beneath the surface. Meghan Markle, once a Hollywood actress, is now a former royal navigating the complex interplay between celebrity culture and monarchy. Her public image has been carefully curated over years, blending advocacy, philanthropy, and personal branding. Each appearance, therefore, carries multiple layers of meaning. When she steps out in an outfit that evokes the spirit of Gandhi, Diana, and Oprah simultaneously, it is not merely fashion. It is commentary, intentional or otherwise. It is an invitation for conversation, and sometimes for controversy. As Meghan advanced across the red carpet, the cameras captured it all. Wide shots of the venue, tight angles on her ensemble, and candid shots of the crowd's reactions created a narrative before she even spoke a word. Observers noted the way the cape flowed like liquid silk, the crispness of her white shirt, and the minimalist elegance of her accessories. Every element conveyed intention, yet intention alone cannot control perception. What she saw in her outfit, a statement of empowerment, refinement, and homage, others saw as a complex mix of audacity, symbolism, and perhaps a misalignment with cultural sensitivities. Inside the venue, the atmosphere was electric. Attendees whispered, eyes darting from Meghan to one another. The front row, populated with editors, designers, and A-list celebrities, exchanged glances that were equal parts admiration and curiosity. Some envied her poise. Others questioned whether the ensemble was too overt, too symbolic, too much of a statement for an event meant to celebrate the designs of Balenciaga rather than the persona of a single attendee. And yet, in this theater of style, every eye was locked on her. She had achieved the impossible, commanding attention in a room filled with figures accustomed to commanding attention themselves. But attention is a double-edged sword. With focus comes judgment, and with judgment comes commentary. It is here, in this delicate balance between admiration and critique, that Chris Rock would enter the scene and change the narrative. His commentary did not simply critique an outfit. It amplified, distorted, and magnified every nuance of Meghan's public persona. In one fell swoop, the ensemble transformed from a bold fashion statement to a cultural flashpoint, sparking conversations that would dominate headlines for days, if not weeks. The psychology behind this spectacle cannot be ignored. Meghan Markle exists at the intersection of royalty, celebrity, and activism, a trifecta that demands constant navigation of public expectations. Every outfit, every word, every gesture is measured against historical precedent, media narratives, and audience perceptions. Her presence in Paris, in this white ensemble, was a calculated risk, a bold assertion of identity, and yet, like all calculated risks in public life, it was subject to unpredictable outcomes. She was, in many ways, performing a delicate dance, asserting individuality while managing the expectations of a global audience. Photographers and journalists quickly dissected the symbolism. Some noted the historical echoes, the flowing cape reminiscent of royal ceremonial garb, the purity of white evoking Gandhi's simplicity and peace, the minimalist elegance nodding to Diana's understated yet commanding presence. The comparisons were not accidental. The world noticed that Meghan often carefully curates her public appearances to convey multiple layers of meaning. Yet, even the most deliberate symbolism can backfire in an environment as scrutinizing as Paris Fashion Week. Public reaction followed swiftly. Social media users posted images, GIFs, and memes, some praising the audacity, others ridiculing it. Discussions of cultural appropriation, performative symbolism, and celebrity branding erupted online. Within hours, Meghan's ensemble had become more than clothing. It had become a lightning rod for debate, analysis, and speculation. Every detail, from the cut of the fabric to the choice of color, was examined under the unforgiving lens of public scrutiny. The tension in the room was palpable as Meghan navigated the sea of cameras and crowds. Designers, editors, and influencers whispered among themselves. Fashion insiders speculated on the intent behind every detail. Observers questioned whether this was a calculated risk or a misstep. And in this moment, the red carpet transformed from a showcase of clothing into a stage where identity, perception, and ambition collided. But the true turning point arrived when Chris Rock, the comedian known for his sharp wit and fearless commentary, took the stage. He didn't comment on the fabrics, the stitching, or the runway designs. Instead, he targeted the essence of Meghan's public persona. His quip, "You can't fight the monarchy, heal the world, and sell skincare all at once," was more than humor. It was a mirror held up to the contradictions inherent in Meghan's attempt to embody multiple iconic figures while navigating the complex realities of fame, influence, and monarchy. The room erupted. Laughter, gasps, and whispers punctuated the air. Social media accounts lit up instantly. Journalists typed furiously, capturing every nuance of expression, gesture, and response. And Meghan, poised yet visibly aware, faced a moment that would define the evening. The ensemble she had chosen, the statement she had intended to make, had become a catalyst for a global conversation about identity, ambition, and perception. This spectacle, the walk, the look, the lighting, the crowd, the flashbulbs, was more than a fashion moment. It was a cultural event, a collision of worlds, a live demonstration of how celebrity, royalty, and personal branding intersect in ways that can surprise even the most seasoned public figures. Every step Meghan took on that red carpet, every flutter of the cape, every tilt of the head, was analyzed, shared, and scrutinized. She had entered the arena on her terms, but the arena had its own rules. And in the moments that followed, whispers backstage hinted at the ramifications yet to come. Designers, assistants, and insiders speculated. How would this be received internationally? Would Meghan respond publicly or strategically remain silent? How would the royal family perceive this display, given the historical weight of fashion choices among royals? And perhaps most importantly, how would this singular moment, an entrance, an outfit, a statement, shape the narrative for the days and weeks ahead? Paris Fashion Week had witnessed many iconic entrances, many unforgettable moments, and many headline-grabbing controversies. But Meghan Markle's arrival that night combined all of these elements and added a new layer of complexity, the intersection of celebrity critique and royal scrutiny, amplified by a comedian whose timing was impeccable. The result was a spectacle that would dominate social media, news outlets, and public discourse alike. The night was far from over. The lights, the cameras, the whispers, and the glances all signaled that something monumental had occurred. Meghan's walk across the Paris red carpet wasn't merely a physical journey. It was a symbolic statement, a calculated risk, and, unbeknownst to her, the perfect setup for the punchline that would echo around the world. And as the echoes of camera shutters and murmurs faded, one truth remained. This night was just the beginning. Every reaction, every critique, and every conversation it sparked was only the start of a saga that would unfold in ways no one could have predicted. But what happened next, the moment that turned fashion spectacle into a cultural flashpoint, would shock the world, redefine the narrative, and leave everyone watching wondering, what does Meghan Markle do when the spotlight hits hardest?